You're live, ma'am. Ma'am, it's broadcasting.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the seminar of the English department, Shulini University. We've already had an inaugural session on Friday, and thank you so much for your support that day, because our site was visited a number of times. In fact, we had about 2,200 visits to our Facebook post. So we are back again. Today is Monday, and we have the first session, so to speak, in which we have these panelists who are here before you. Let me first introduce you to my colleagues all over again. We have, first of all, Neeraj. Neeraj.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I, on behalf of Shulini University and the Department of English, once again welcome you to the international seminar.
Now we have Purnima Bali.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So after having a spectacular inaugural session on Friday, this is definitely going to be the landmark for all of us. So looking forward to interactive sessions. Thank you and welcome.
And Lata Negi.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So today is the first day of international seminar and we are very excited and very proud to be able to host it. And it is my true pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lata, Neeraj and Purnima. And those of you who are seeing me for the first time, my name is Manju Jetka and I'm the one who has been bombarding you with emails. All right, so we have this session today in which we have one chairperson and we have 7 speakers. I'll just quickly name them before they are introduced by the chairperson. Ankita is here, Oindrela, Sudipta, Harpreet Vora, Disha. These are the people who are already here, and we are still waiting for Sanjay Mukherjee, and we are waiting for Ek Prasad from Nepal to join us. Now, before I hand over the proceedings to the chairperson of the day, who is Manpreet, I want to bring to your notice that, we are living in times which are unprecedented. We've never had a situation like this earlier. And, well, we have to make the best of it. So that is what we are trying to do. And we are trying to grapple with the tools that we have, with the technology that we have. From time to time, there will be failures. Yes, we have to be prepared for that. But we cannot sit down and just give up. So we will keep trying, and if at all there are technical glitches, we'll try and get over them. Otherwise, life does not stop still. Life will still keep moving. So I believe Sanjay is here. Sanjay, where are you? I just got Sanjay's message. We cannot see you, Sanjay. Please switch on your video and your speaker. And Ek Prasad is left now. All right. Now let me introduce you to Manpreet. Manpreet.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, so that is Manpreet Kang, and she's a professor of English at Indraprasth University in Delhi. I also need to tell you that she has been my student, and a very good student she was. So this is Manpreet Kang, who is a professor of English at Dwarka, Indraprasth University. Yeah, Guru Gobind Singh, Indraprasth University. And she's not just that, she also holds some important positions in the university, like dean and big boss and a lot of other things. And she's also the president of an international society called the International American Studies Association. And she's an office bearer with our Mellow that you're all familiar with, right? So Manpreet, welcome and thank you so much. And really, I'm very proud of her because she did her PhD with me. And in spite of me, she did well, right? So Manpreet, well, over to you. And all the participants are here except for Ek Prasad. Sanjay, where are you? I cannot see Sanjay. I cannot see Sanjay. Anyway, now Manpreet, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first session of the seminar. Rather, we should call it, these days the term is webinar on a century in retrospect, literary signposts and watersheds of the last 100 years. But again, before we proceed, I'd like to reply to ma'am and say, ma'am, not despite you, but because of you, I am where I am. Anyways, to proceed further, and I'm proud to be your first PhD student. Anyways. So yes, we are here, I think all excited because I've looked at the abstracts. We have a wonderful lineup of papers. We have 7 papers waiting for the 7th panelist to join us. Meanwhile, I'll briefly introduce the presenters in the sequence they'll be presenting, and then I'll request them to present their papers. We'll be giving 12 minutes to each presenter. And then when all the presentations are done with, we'll have a question and answer session, so that there can be comparison, contrast between the authors, poets, and we have 3 major iconic writers, poets lined up for today. We have 3 speakers speaking on the wasteland. Eliot's iconic wasteland needs no introduction. Similarly, we have 3 speakers speaking on Philip Larkin, the poet, and 2 speakers on The Outsider, Camus' very well-known novel. So the speakers for the day are, we have Anita Bhaumik, who's a PhD scholar at NIT Meghalaya, and I'll introduce her topic before she speaks. We have Sanjay Mukherjee, Professor of English, Saurashtra University. We then have Andrila Ghosh, Associate Professor and Head, Department of English, Diamond Harbour Women's University, West Bengal. We have Sudipta Saha, Lecturer, Department of English, Surendra Nath College, Kolkata. We then have Ek Prasad, Assistant Professor, Department of Management, Informatics and Communication, School of Management, Kathmandu University. We are hoping he'll join in. And we have Harpreet Vora, who teaches at the Punjab University Regional Center, Ludhiana. And then we have Disha Pokhriyal, who's a PhD scholar at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. So I think with this, we are ready to begin. And I think I'll invite now, without further delay, the 2 papers on the wasteland. And I think we're all looking forward to the wasteland and how, the wasteland has, across the centuries and still relevant now, caught the attention of young, senior scholars alike. Ankita Bhaumik, I invite you to speak, and she'll be speaking on the leitmotif of the mythical quest, the wasteland and the Great Gatsby. And she'll be focusing on the common themes of mythology between the wasteland and the Great Gatsby. Very interesting, huh? Yes. Ankita, over to you, and your time starts now.
A very good afternoon to everyone. I am Ankita Bhaumik, a research scholar from NIT Meghalaya. And today I will be speaking about the leitmotif of the mythical quest, the wasteland and the Great Gatsby. So we all know that one of the greatest literary work that has left a remarkable mark is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, that gained tremendous popularity in the post-war era of skepticism. In the poem, Eliot draws a parallel between the mythical chronicles and the contemporary history. Likewise, another literary work that gained immense popularity and holds up a mirror to the society is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. He also, like Eliot, included the traditional Arthurian and medieval motifs in his short fictions and novels, and especially in The Great Gatsby. A reciprocal admiration existed between the two authors, that is between Fitzgerald and Eliot, and the close affinity of the two texts of The Great Gatsby to The Wasteland has been the subject of much critical writing. As John W. Bicknell says, that Fitzgerald knew the poem by heart. And A. Dyson stated, and I quote, T.S. Eliot found himself as moved and interested by The Great Gatsby as he had been by any novel for a very long time. So in this presentation, I will attempt to draw a parallel between T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. As we all know that America was once the promised land. It was a kind of new Eden that embodied freedom, hope, and individualism. And that in the 19th century, unfortunately yields to consumerism, forgetting its original roots. In Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, the character J. Gatsby becomes an Adamic hero, whom the character Nick Carraway named a son of God. J. Gatsby denies his origins, his parents, his birthplace, and even his name, and creates a new self-made man. In this sense, the character of J. Gatsby reminds us of James Frazer's Christ Solar Hero, on which The Wasteland is essentially based. In the novel The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald uses the adjective grey to describe both things and people. The land is grey, the men who work on the railroad are ash grey, the lines of railroad cars are grey. Fitzgerald's Valley of Ashes is thus analogous to Eliot's Valley of Dry Bones, the wasteland, the dusty replica of modern society, where the people are spiritually dead. Another thing that is very important to the Gatsby story and suggestive of the wasteland are the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. At certain crucial moments in the story, the giant signboard plastered with an advertisement for spectacles come into view. The imagery of this billboard deeply penetrates the reader's imagination, and especially when the character George, Martha's husband in the novel, equates its eye with the eyes of God. The timeless vision of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg presides over the main action and the denouement of the novel. And as John W. Bicknell affirms, and I quote, the grotesque image reappearing throughout the story eventually becomes a symbol of what God has become in the modern world, an all-seeing deity, indifferent, faceless, blank. A different attitude is adopted in Eliot's Wasteland, however, in which an all-seeing eye is represented by means of Tiresias' blindness. Tiresias, the famous soothsayer of Thebes, articulates Eliot's poem as he is the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest. And this I have taken from Eliot's notes itself. His ability, Tiresias' ability to foresee the future goes back to the fact that he was gifted with the capacity of prophecy, and he shared both male and female features, which provided him an absolute knowledge. Tiresias' eyes are wise, timeless, visionary, and unspoiled, just like the premonitory eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg, a symbol of the eyes of God. Thus, it could be said then that both The Great Gatsby and The Wasteland explore the question of a secularized world, where God appears as a blind spectator. Now, I will be talking about another image, the image of the wheel, that is a central motif in the poem The Wasteland. The Wheel of Fortune appears in the poem as the fourth card of Madame Sosostris, says Tarot, and it reveals the irredeemable fate of all the characters. The wheel spins and spins a spiral movement, unstoppable, punishing the wastelanders to empty revolutions. No one can escape from its fate. The wheel represents the beginning and the end, and life and death, as it is the natural order of things. Apart from its structure, The Great Gatsby also shows a series of images that resemble the circularity of the Wheel of Fortune as the spherical shape of East and West egg. A more eloquent description of this is given by Jordan Bakers in chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby, and I quote, "Life starts all over again, and when it gets crisps in the fall," unquote. The character Jordan Baker here resembles Eliot's Madame Sosostris, a failed prophetess, and foresees Gatsby's death on the first day of the autumn. Gatsby, like the Westlanders, repeats an ancient script and draws his identity from myth. And what is more is that through Gatsby's fall, the ultimate meaning of death changes. Death now becomes a necessary step towards regeneration, thus completing the revolution of the wheel. There are other various interiors in the Westland and the Great Gatsby that also show a parallelism. In the Wasteland, the action unfolds in a lady's boudoir and in a pub. These spaces correspond to Fitzgerald's description of Daisy's rich mansion and of Martle's shabby apartment. In the first place, the neurasthenic woman in her boudoir, like Daisy, is described by the emblems of a culture: a golden cupid, the severed branch candelabra, Cleopatra's furnished throne, Philomela's painting, and etc. The same contrast between the material possessions and spiritual poverty can be found in Martle's apartment and in the pub of Eliot's poem. In both the settings, gossip and empty conversation prevail. In Eliot's section of chess, where a treacherous friend talks with impunity about Lil's life. Eliot ends his poem with moral statements that bring about redemption: give, sympathize, control. The words that come from the parable of the thunder, and thus corresponds to Fitzgerald's conclusions. According to the critic Litha O'Doy, both Eliot and Fitzgerald have invented new rules for their characters to play. The former is fictional, the later mythological but suggestive. And both writers have the same visions as allegory of political and social implications. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ankita. That was well within the time limit, and well, I think you can expect a lot of questions because it's not a very usual thing to be comparing Eliot and Gatsby, well, or the Wasteland and Gatsby, to put it in the right perspective. So, well, you can wait for the questions. Meanwhile, I'll invite the second speaker. We have him here, right? I don't see him. Professor Sanjay Mukherjee.
On to the next one.
Okay. So while we wait for him, we'll now move on to Andrela Ghosh, Associate Professor. She's speaking on vanguarding the movement, Philip Larkin's traditionalism, and she'll be focusing on Larkin's contribution to movement poetry, which is what he is well known for. So over to you, Andrela, and you have your 12 minutes. You are muted, Andrela. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, respected chairperson. And as you've already introduced my topic, I will not go about
Andrela, I don't know if it's me, but I think you'll have to increase your volume. You're a little low on the volume.
Hello? Is it
yeah,
better?
that's better. If you could increase your volume.
Yeah.
On your system?
Yeah, it is it's perked to the maximum actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I will be looking at Philip Larkin as an anti-modernist, chiefly as a traditionalist and somebody who had close affinities with the poetry of Thomas Hardy. That is going to be my main concern in my presentation. Now, the poets of the 1950s, or the movement poets as we know them, were first time hailed by D.J. Scott, who was literary editor of the
I'm
Spectator.
so sorry to interrupt you, but I need to ask everybody, is she audible or is it my system? I can't hear her clearly.
So I think she had a problem because because earlier when we were testing it out, this is the maximum she can do. So she'll just have to, use her lung power.
Okay.
As loud as you can. Come on, you can do it.
Bring the mic as close as you can. If the technical help can do something, that'll be great. Okay, Andrila.
So again, the movement poets were called the movement poets, first of all, because they were vastly different from the poets who were writing in the 1930s and the 1940s, chiefly the modernist poets, and who did not actually submit to any great theoretical systems or any unconscious commands from any logical compulsion. What they were more concerned with were an empirical attitude towards life and towards poetry. And also the movement poetry never started as a proper literary group. There were no alliances between them, and some of the movement poets did not have the sense that, am I audible? I'm just breaking.
Yes, carry on.
Okay. And they were not even aware that they were consciously part of any poetry or literary group. So whenever the theoretical contours of this movement poetry are discussed or analyzed, it has to be by looking at the individual poets and their poetry, and Philip Larkin is no exception to this. Now, very briefly, going into the biography of Larkin, which I'm sure will be reiterated again by the other speakers who are going to speak on Larkin. His dates are 1922 to 1985. He was born in Coventry and lived and worked for a large part of his life in the county of Hull. And again, he became so popular during his time and for his contribution to English native tradition that he, although he rejected the offer of becoming the poet laureate in the 1980s, he was always dubbed as the England's other poet laureate. And again, we must also remember that the acclaim that he earned was on the basis of very few, very slim volumes of poetry that he produced. In fact, 4 volumes of poetry on which his entire fame rests. And again, not much time to go into the biography, but I must mention that although he was very popular in his time and much loved in his time, he did suffer a kind of critical neglect in the early 21st century because of several letters that were discovered and also the comments that were made in the biography by Andrew Motion, where a lot of his prejudices like racism and other negative elements of his personality were discovered. It's only very late in 2016 that he received a space in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey when his critical acclaim was sort of reified. So again, I will be mainly looking at his anti-modernist stand, his aversion to the theories that were put forward, especially by T.S. Eliot, his closeness to the Georgian poets, his and ultimately his adoration for the work of Thomas Hardy, whom he felt to be his actual literary or poetic master. So again, his early poetry was largely dominated by Yeatsian influence. He was greatly motivated by Yeats's symbolism, but again, very soon he realized that Yeats is not the perfect model for him. It's Hardy who actually is the model for him because he believed in this kind of simplicity in poetry, which could connect poetry, the poet with the lay audience. So again, if we go back to the collection of poetry brought out by D.J. Enright in 1956, an anthology called The Poets of the 1950s, and Enright himself was a movement poet, Larkin wrote something very important, which is at the center of his work. And I just quote from this book. He says, no belief in tradition, that he had no belief in tradition or a common myth kitty or casual allusions in other poems to other poems or poets. Close quotes. Then what was he doing? When I'm trying to place Larkin as a traditionalist, was he actually rejecting something called tradition? No. His later interviews and his criticisms and his poetry go on to show that he was very much a traditionalist, but he was rejecting the idea of tradition that was put forth by the modernists, especially like a poet, like the poet T.S. Eliot in his prose pieces, Tradition and the Individual Talent, 1919, and the Metaphysical Poets, 1921. where Eliot is talking about poetry, poet who has to be conscious of not only the entire tradition of his own country, but of the entire European tradition. And he has to have something called historical sense, which means that he has to be aware of the entire tradition of poetry which went before him. So each poem in that way becomes connected with something that went before, putting the heavy burden of elucidation and understanding on an audience who no longer be lay. The audience has to be equally erudite and equally intelligent. This was Larkin's chiefest contention or aversion to modernism. And he, along with the movement poets, felt that it is because of Eliot and Pound that poetry had chiefly become an academic subject where elucidation and difficulty had become part of poetic tradition rather than the simplicity or the connection with life which it had when the Georgians were writing. So again, the chief conflict that emerges between the movement poets headed by Larkin and Eliotian or Pound's theories of poetry is the question of rhetoric, the question of allusion, the question of excessive use of metaphors and symbols, which Larkin did not feel was doing any good for the native tradition. And again, I will skip over first and I will try to connect Larkin with Hardy, who was a great mentor for him. He was introduced to his poetry in 1946, and the anti-romantic stance, the classical restraint, colloquialism, irony, and finding poetry in the midst of the mundane and monotony of life is something that connects Larkin to Hardy. And also this awareness that both poets had of their sense of responsibility to their reader and to their audiences, which the modernists, according to Larkin, did not have, because it was not, and he was also against Eliot when Eliot felt that the poet in this modern world, as modern civilization as it stands, necessarily needs to be difficult. So difficulty in poetry was something that Larkin was completely against, along with the movement poets. So if I move on to certain examples that show that Larkin was extremely devoted to Hardy and borrowed not only thematically but structurally and stylistically from Hardy, I think there will be some time to look at a few examples. For example, the ending of a poem called Toads Revisited by Larkin, which is very famous. If you look at the lines from the ending of the poem, "Give me your arm, old toad, help me down Cemetery Road," is modeled and is deeply influenced by one of the first poems in the She to Him sequence of Hardy, which says, I quote, will you not grant to old affection's claim the hand of friendship down life's sunless hill? And again, if you look at the various railway poems which Hardy wrote, where he is realistically capturing frame by frame the views that one can see while traveling in a railway carriage, had a deep influence on the writing of a poem like The Whitsun Weddings. So again, Larkin's adoration and high regard for Hardy did not end here. Every time, whenever he was bringing in allusions to other poets in any form in his poetry, he would try to undercut it. He would try to sort of deflate it by upholding the example or bringing in the influence of Hardy once again. For instance, if you look at the title of a poem like Sad Steps, which is supplied by Sydney's Astrophel and Stella, but Larkin seems to deflate and to underrate this influence by trying to bring in the influence of poems of Hardy which are related to the moon. Shut out that moon, and I looked up from my writing. And also poems like Requiem, which borrow their title, the poem Requiem by R.L. Stevenson, which supplies him the title of his poem. Let this be the verse, is a poem which is very sentimental, but Larkin borrows the title but undercuts this sentimentality by trying to model his trophies from Hardy's epitaph for a pessimist. So again, time and again, Hardy's style, Hardy's music, Hardy's manner, Hardy's vision of poetry are administered as correctives to the excesses of earlier poets, to the high romanticism of the earlier poets. And Larkin does not use Hardy just as a portal to the past. Rather, he uses Hardy as a litmus test. Litmus test of what? Of subjecting the tradition to the acid of modernity. This is the way that he is constantly trying to use Hardy as a touchstone for great poetry. And even in those instances when Hardy is used as a kind of antidote to other authors, he is actually using the method of citation that was followed much allusion and citation by the modernists. He is not being true to his own idea or his own premise that poetry is not born out of other poems, but it is born out of being oneself in life. Even in being in maintaining fidelity through this betrayal, he's actually replicating, he is using Hardy perhaps at a thematic level, and he is using Hardy at the expenses of other authors, but at the same time, he is not willing to be subservient to the views of his master. So this is how he's constant, and this can be seen very well in a very famous poem called Obaid. There's going to be no time to talk about Obaid here in detail, but it's one of the most fascinating poems where the techniques that he borrowed from Hardy are very, very clearly visible. And again, he at a technical level, he learned the use of qualifiers, negative suffixes and prefixes from Hardy, which make his poetry somber, mundane, monotonous, and apparently pessimistic, because I wouldn't agree with the fact that Hardy was a pessimist, so I cannot call Larkin a pessimist either. So again, the classical restraint and this connection with the audience, which Hardy always maintained in his poetry, is something that Larkin himself upheld, along with other movement poets who believed that they needed to go back. Like the modernists, the modernists are harking towards tradition in a different way. Larkin and the movement poets are harking towards tradition in a very different way. It's a kind of reaction. It's a reactionary harking back to bring back the connectivity, that was lost since Georgian poetry. Remember that most of the Georgian poets were looking up to Hardy as a very important influence. And I think I will just end with a very interesting reminder to everybody who, I'm sure everybody remembers this already, that when Larkin was asked to edit the anthology of Oxford Book of Modern Verse in 1966, he had objection to the use of the word modern. He wanted to rename this collection because he felt that it restricted the inclusion of great poetry. And finally, when in 1973 the book was published, the anthology was published, it was renamed as Oxford Book of 20th Century English Verse, where Housman, Hardy, Kipling, de la Mare, Edward Thomas, Robert Graves, and Walter Benjamin were generously represented, and not surprisingly, Ezra Pound was dropped. And even when he was asked to give examples of the exemplars of poetry, the names that he took out of those 5 names were the names who were counted as Georgian poets, including Hardy, who was not a Georgian poet, but he was a great influence on the Georgians. So again, there could be a long talk on this entire idea of Larkin's battle with modernism, which he looked upon as an onslaught of Americans, especially Ezra Pound and Eliot, which the movement poets, all of them felt, and they had this idea that it was because of the onslaught of this American form of modernism which destroyed the traditional native Englishness of poetry. And I think I will wind up with this, saying that Larkin was deeply connected to a generation. It was almost like after coming from Wasteland, the praise that Eliot has culled for his Wasteland is somehow undercut by the criticism that was met out to him by Larkin and the movement poets. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrella. You brought out the famous Larkin, trait where he, was influenced by the modernists, but then he dissociated with them and, was more of a realist and, moved away. So, and in fact, the next paper will also be speaking a little bit about the same thing. We have Sudipta Saha, and he'll be speaking on Serious, Proper and Wise, Philip Larkin, the movement and his straightforward representation of the commonplace in poetry. And he'll be highlighting Larkin as a poet of the ordinary man. So in a way, he'll be kind of also building up or taking on what you said, Andrella. So let's see what Sudipta Saha has to say. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope I'm audible to all of you.
Yeah.
Yes,
a little
very
louder
clear.
if you can.
Very
A
clear.
little louder if you can.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I'll be basically through my paper, I'll be basically focusing on the representation of the commonplace, the representation of the ordinary life, the representation of the ordinary people through Larkin's poetry. Now, when Professor Ghosh was speaking just before me, she mentioned a lyric by Larkin, "This be the verse." Now, I will be just starting my speech through that very 4 lines of that poem, the first 4 lines of that poem. Forgive me if a few words are offensive in that. Forgive me, but those are not my words, those are Larkin's words. Now, the first 4 lines of the poem, "This be the verse," written by Larkin in April 1971. So the 4 lines goes as like this: "They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with faults they had and add some extra just for you." So these are the 4 lines from "This Be the Verse" by Philip Larkin. The first 4 lines, this is a very short poem of 12 lines. So these are the first 4 lines. And in this poem, in this short lyric, rather than honoring one's parents and respecting and remembering when they die, Larkin focuses on a very different aspect of this parent-child relationship, and that is resentment. Now, very few times when talking about a parent-child relationship, when talking about respecting parents, remembering parents, people, I don't think people will ever come out with this word resentment in that relationship. So this is what Larkin is all about. And this poem, even after ages, in April 2009, this first 4 lines of the poem, the 4 lines I have just recited, was recited by Lord Justice Wall as a renowned justice in England, as part of a judgment during the hearing of a messy divorce case in the Court of Appeals, which involved the custody arrangements of a 9-year-old child. Now you can imagine how it is to recite such a poem by a justice in a courtroom during a messy divorce case. So this was the impact of Philip Larkin and what do we call as quote unquote the movement, even after more than 20 years of his death. Okay, now Larkin is regarded as a step ahead. He's still regarded as a step ahead and have been one of the major voices that aid other citizens in their struggle to delineate the nature of their concerns about their society and the changes that must be coped up with in the society, which is both incorporated and internalized in the daily life of the ordinary people. Now, mainly Professor Ghosh, who has spoken just before me, has taken up much part of the movement poetry as a whole. I'll be just giving out some points because without discussing a few points of movement poetry, Larkin would be just useless to discuss. So the movement poets, of whom Larkin was a very major part, thought that poetry had to be responsive to the present conditions. And along with it, there was a want for the poetry to be intelligible to the people who were less intellectually equipped and as well as less acquainted with the world they lived in and the history of the world in which they were surviving. So, and because of that, the movement poets, including Philip Larkin as a whole, did not want language to take a center stage in their poetry. The movement had a gentle sense of irony in it. They presented their themes without any kind of exaggerations, dealt with simple events and various experiences of the modern life, and were unwilling, modern life, I meant contemporary life at that time, and were unwilling to place too abstract questions and theories. Though we now present Larkin's poetry through, we see Larkin's poetry through various theories, even we put it into Marxist theory, we put his poetry into structuralist theories, feminist theories, of course, it has to come. But what the movement poets and Larkin especially wanted, that their poetry should not bring abstract questions and should not put in and should not be theoretized. Now, before coming into some of the poems of Larkin, I'll just give you a brief introduction on the period period in which Larkin was writing. So Larkin was writing in the period which spans over 3 decades. His major writings almost, which spans over 3 decades. One is the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, the 3 very crucial decades in the history of England. In 1950s, as we all know, that the legacy of the Second World War was haunting Britain, and Britain was putting all effort to rebuild itself, as it was a nation torn by war. And gradually, at the end of 1950s, Britain came out as a golden age of the welfare state, taking consideration into the economy, considering the finance, considering the economy, everything, the health, everything. Now, coming on to the 1960s, the 1960s come out as a very crucial point in almost in a majority part of Larkin's poem, because 1960 was a decade of rapid change in England, also which is also known as the swinging 60s. Swinging 60s, and as it saw the shift from the black and white to the technicolor. So there was a kind of change through which people saw the entire world. Those who could not go out of the house could see the world through television, could see the world through their own, that idiot box. Now, and in 1960s, London had transformed from the bleak conservative city into a capital full of freedom, full of hope, and full of promises. And also one very important theme that has also come in Larkin's poetry, when I'll be talking about Annus Mirabilis, is that in 1960s, there was a revolutionary change in music, which was brought by Beatles. So the coming of Beatles to the forefront, to the people, to being accessible to the people, the Beatles, is a revolutionary thing in this entire 1960 decade. And in 1970s, almost the last decade where Larkin was majorly writing his poems, was a dark decade in the history of England. It was a decade of strikes. It was a decade strikes by postal workers, miners, dustmen, and it saw the streets strewn by rubbish. The London streets, various streets of Manchester, Liverpool, strewn by rubbish. Now, this poem, when I say in 1970 it was a decade of strikes and specifically miners, this miners I'm specifically focusing because Larkin also writes about the miners in his poem, The Explosion. Okay, in his poem, The Explosion, Larkin writes about these miners, which is a very important poem when it comes to a very ordinary life, the life of mining. Now, through this, we can understand that Larkin sees life as much to be endured and less to be enjoyed. His poetry shows a full response to the contemporary life, and he found significance in the very commonplace, in the very ordinary life of the people. Like some of the examples I can give you is in his poem Ambulances, he deals with the omnipresence of death, the death that is hanging over every human being, every living being in this world. In his poem Going, Going, it is a satire on the avarice of the materialistic people. though it was a government-sponsored poem, it has a hard-hitting environmental message, where basically Larkin's forecasts on the absolute destruction of the countryside. In church going, you can see that Larkin deals with the absurdity and meaninglessness of the religion. In Maiden Name, when if you say that Larkin was not writing about women, but in Maiden Name, Larkin was dealing with the identity of women after marriage, that what happens to their identity when they take up their husband's surname. In Wands, Larkin was questioning the fundamental human need for seclusion. In the poem Days, the importance of days in one's life, Larkin was questioning that. And also his famous two poems, which are very personal, but that is also when he deals with the ordinary life. His personal life was also some kind of an ordinary life. In Reference Back, he tells about his relationship with Eva Larkin, his mother. And in Dockery and Son, Larkin tells about the journey, his journey to home. And in Annus Mirabilis and High Windows, Larkin attracts his readers. Larkin attracts the attention of his readers towards the sexual liberation, And Annus Mirabilis, the poem, it starts with a startling manner. Like if I can quote the first two lines of the poem, like, quote, "Sexual intercourse began in 1963. Now, a poem beginning with the words sexual intercourse began in 1963. It is only possible for Larkin because through this poem, he was comparing the sexual freedom in England from the past and the present. Because this is only possible because in the hands of Larkin. So through this, we can see that Larkin's poetry is a combination of the argumentative and also the incongruous. So his critics talk of his anti-intellectual social attitude when he brings fornication, when he brings sexual intercourse. So his critics deals with this anti-intellectual social attitude, and which Larkin always thought that it is needed. Then provincialism, gloom, and always anti-modernism. But what as readers, the readers have seen is his longer poems are grandiloquent and authoritative, and his shorter poems has grace, and they are humorous and they are sharp. That means it hits you at the very first line when you start reading it. And Larkin stood firmly against the values of modernism, and at the same time, he was also heavily concerned with the key themes of modernism. And the key themes of modernism, that is two of the key themes of modernism, that is alienation and the isolation of modern life, which were also the themes representing through the decade, through the 3 decades when Larkin was writing his poetry. Now, Larkin always wanted his readers to create a permanent bond with his readers, and he has always focused on the personal emotions, and he hated to present excessive emotions in his poetry. Now, in his volumes of poetry, The Not Shared, The Less Deceived, The Whitsun Weddings, and we find the differences of class and cultures prominently, and the inevitability of death. And according to Larkin, as I've already said when I'm talking about ambulances, the omnipresence of death. And according to Larkin, all human activities have the shadow of death in it. So his response to death was not, okay, yes ma'am, okay, sure. And his response to death was not like W.B. Yeats's heroic struggle to win time and death, but as Professor Ghosh was speaking, that Larkin had an enduring effect of Hardy in him. So here also, while dealing with death, Larkin was similar to Thomas Hardy in this passive acceptance of an adverse destiny. That means whatever it is, Larkin asks his readers to accept it, and not like Yeats, who wants to heroically win the time and death thing. And through his poetry, this specifically, I feel that Larkin speaks directly to his readers, and the real as well as the imagery that is in Larkin is connected in such a way that the readers also seem to be conversing with the poet. And he feels that the surrounding of the commonplace and connects the ordinary in an ordinary way. And in Larkin's poetry, the real is an integral part, and his crafts lie in the adoption of the radically different persona and postures, which was very difficult to find in the poetry of various other modernist writers and beyond. And Larkin's, and just 2 lines at the end, just concluding it, Larkin's poetry, I think it bridges the gap between the poem as a form and the poem as a theme, and it presents the text as a real story of human life, which only few poets of both the modern age, both the keeping apart the movement poetry and beyond, only few could do, keeping the real story of the human life in their poetry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudipta. So, Sudipta, through his paper, was trying to show us how Larkin was trying to be a poet of the people and the ordinary, but like his critics said, that probably going to the other extreme. In fact, listening to some of the quotes, I think, again, that can be discussed later. He sounds more like somewhat closer to the confessionalists and the beat poets. Well, maybe we'll take that up later. Meanwhile, we do have Professor Sanjay Mukherjee, but he's somewhere in the listeners and he's not able to log on. It's a request, Professor Mukherjee, could you please call up Professor Jedka on her phone, and she'll try and get you on board onto the panel. So while that's going on, we'll move on to the next presenter. And since we finally do have Ek Prasad here with us, happy to have you here and welcome from Kathmandu University. So he will be speaking on Philip Larkin, and he's titled his paper Intangible Days, and he'll be discussing the poem Days, which he feels is obscure and abstruse. So over to you, Dr. Ek Prasad. You need to unmute yourself. You're muted, and you have 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Distinguished panelist, respected Jadab ma'am, fellow presenters, and lovely audience. Warm good afternoon from Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal. Today, my presentation title is on Philip Larkin's one of the poems, Days. So many, few of the speakers have already shed light on Philip Larkin. I think I'm the last speaker, and it's a bit challenging what to say. I'll mostly focus on the topic, the poem itself. Have you read The Days?
Don't remember.
Have you read the poem?
It's a short poem. Why don't you read it? It's a short poem. Read it out to him.
Yeah. I'm gonna read it. Well, Days by Philip Larkin. What are days for? They come, they wake us, time and time over. They are to be happy in. Where can we live but days? Solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the fields. So that's the poem. Generally, Philip Larkin, as you know, writes long poems and with meter, but this one is a free verse. However, the poem doesn't seem that simple, though there are only 2 paragraphs and there are only few words, but the poet has used full of images here. So what is the poem about? This poem is a thought process which proposes the unanswerable question, what are the days for? Which he has asked as an innocent child. Indirectly, Larkin is questioning what will happen when we run out of days. That means when we will die. Where can we leave but days? Is the saying what happens to us when we run out of days? That is when we die. Exploring the deeper level, we can find the alternative beliefs, life after death, the image of the priest and the doctor simultaneously illustrate the scientist and the priest. Within this poem, it suggests days are to be happy in. On the other hand, the fact is puzzling about what will happen to him when he dies could suggest life is first boredom, then fear, as expressed in other poems. So you can sense use of simple language in his poem as he departed from Dylan Thomas and W.B. Yeats for using emotions only in their poems, high emotions, lack of logics. We can see or feel that in this poem here. Again, this poem is not as simple as other poems are. So this is all about Day's interpretation. If you have any question, I can answer. I want to save time for other presenters too.
So we'll be taking the questions all together in the end, Ek. So in case you do want to say something more there, you still have some time. Otherwise, we'll proceed.
All right, ma'am. I would just like to share some additional information about Philip Larkin. As the previous speakers have said, he was born in UK, England, didn't travel abroad, was proposed as the poet laureate in 1984, I think, but he declined. Still is regarded as a very prestigious poet. And he never married. He did only one job, that was a librarian. And he was a key figure in the movement, though the term was coined by J.D. Scott, but he's regarded as one of the key figures of that movement. And he was also influenced largely by Samuel Beckett. We can find similar themes between them. And oppose modernism, but we're not oppose modernism, but we're not anti-modernist. These are some of the unique features are found in him. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Ekta. That was short and brief, but yes, you highlighted the poem Days, which we can discuss later. And I also wanted to request all our listeners that you can start to post your questions on the Q&A icon, like some have already done, so that those questions can be taken up, when we finish all the papers. I now invite, we move on to the next writer, though we were hoping to have Professor Sanjay Mukherjee on board to, continue with the Wasteland, but we will now start with Camus. And so we have Harpreet Vohra from Ludhiana, and she's speaking on The Outsider. The title of her paper is Albert Camus' The Outsider, Standing the Test of Time. And she focuses on the morality and religion through the character of Meursault. And that much talked about famous, character Mersal. So over to you, Harpreet, and you have your 12 minutes. So you need to unmute yourself, Harpreet.
I hope I'm audible now.
That's fine. Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. As Professor Kang just mentioned, the title of my paper is Albert Camus' The Outsider, Standing the Test of Time. And, since the topic of our, seminar was, regarding watersheds and signposts, so I thought that it would be interesting to talk about Camus' novel as being one of them.
May I interrupt, please, just for a minute?
Yes, ma'am.
You're using a cell phone?
Yes, ma'am.
It's shaking a lot. Why don't you bring it up and put it against some support so that it doesn't move so much? It looks as if you're dancing. Sorry.
All right, ma'am.
We'll dance also later on, but for now, yeah, okay. Very good. Thank you, Harpreet.
Okay now, ma'am?
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Thank you.
Okay. Albert Camus' 1942 work, The Outsider, is counted as one of the most influential novels to have been written in the 20th century. This work, which really bust all myths about a human being's haloed existence and protected status, redefined the very notions of, morality, truth, and justice. The paper will examine the reasons why Meursault became the cult figure that he was, with specific focus on two aspects: that's redefining morality and re-examining religion in an absurd world. Morality and religion become very hotly debatable in the absurd universe that Meursault inhabits. And through the many negotiations he makes with these, very axiomatic principles, a new diction of morality and religion sort of emerges. How does Meursault interpret and then finally rework morality and religion in his own terms? These are the questions which are aimed to be addressed by the paper. Meursault, the much condemned man, with his new dialect of indifference, reflects an image to the world of a round ball in a square keg. And it's probably this, quirkiness of the man that gave the book its cult status. Avi Sagi, in his book, Albert Camus and the Philosophy of the Absurd, asks the question, what is the fundamental problem confronting Camus? As Camus tells the readers in his autobiographical work, The First Man, he has been involved from the outset in a contradictory experience involving the sense of crumbling, disintegrating reality, eroding his ontological security, as opposed to a growing yearning for harmony, for a metaphysical and transcendent order. This conflicting experience prompts Camus' inner conflict. The encounters that Meursault has with religion are essentially Christian and begin with the vigil and the funeral of Mother. I think two very important things in the novel. He encounters expectations of certain behaviors from others, which essentially fall within the realm of rite, ritual, and mourning etiquette. All this Meursault finds hard to fathom. He is also surprised, when the caretaker tells him that Mother wanted a religious funeral, when in reality, he never recalled her showing any kind of proclivity towards religion. So it surprises him. His encounter with religion is also seen after the murder, when the magistrate shows him the crucifix, and in an almost cathartic moment, and also at the end of his life, when he physically assaults the chaplain who tells him to seek God before his death. The philosophy of the absurd, which essentially in very simplistic term means that life has no meaning, and yet one has to counter the meaninglessness, has three ways by which the absurdity could be countered according to Camus. The first was physical suicide, the second was religion, and the third was resilience, very much like the Sisyphean conundrum. While physical suicide was cowardice, and much has been spoken of in the myth of Sisyphus, a religion was temporary and only presented momentary freedom. So how does Meursault re-examine religion, if there was any religion at all in an absurd world? And how does he critique the Christian faith and the Christian God? Camus, while he was alive, had given up the Catholic faith, and he considers himself to be an outsider in more ways than one. He said he was an infidel in Algeria and a fallen Catholic in his own community. So the sense of non-belonging that he had made him more and more disenchanted with life and its so-called values. Mousseau is unable to understand the babble, the noise that emanates from institutionalized forms of religion. But what he follows is the principle of absolute truth. He refuses to lie at all times about his mother, about Marie, about his regret having committed murder, about everything. His faith in the principle of truth, however, never makes him imagine that he is engaging in some kind of bravery. It merely makes him believe that he is doing what he wants to do and not even necessarily doing what is right. One can understand Mousseau's attitude towards religion through his approach and reaction to the vigil and the funeral. He wishes to smoke, drink coffee, and even sleep. Natural things that many people would crave for, but never dare to admit in such times. Now, one must remember that sensual pleasures are what Mousseau craves for they define him. He can only understand sensual pleasures, and he is never apologetic about it. Religion often becomes a monolithic structure, instilling fear in devotees. The chaplain instills this fear in Mousseau. He says, "Believe or be damned." But our hero has no faith in or fear of God. In the absurd world, religion is something to be resisted, as it presents a means of offering meaning, a meaning in terms of defining and understanding the universe and the position and interaction of the human being in it. By all standards, Mousseau cannot do this. When he becomes violent for the first time, and he pulls the chaplain by his cassock collar, he says something very significant, an almost new definition of his kind of religion, if you may. I quote, "He seemed certain," this is with reference to the chaplain, "of everything, didn't he? And yet none of his certainties was worth one hair of a woman's head. He couldn't even be sure he was alive because he was living like a dead man. I might seem to be empty-handed, but I was sure of myself, sure of everything, surer than he was, sure of my life, and sure of the death that was coming to me." So, this new definition of his life and how he lived and the surety with which he lived. Now coming to the second aspect, which is, redefining and re-understanding morality. Morality, in simple terms, would mean principles distinguishing between good and bad, or right and wrong. But in terms of an absurd world, does morality hold any good? And is it really possible to make such distinctions? Is Mousseau immoral? Is he evil? Is he wicked because he does not cry at his mother's funeral? Or because he puts her in an old age home? Or because he drinks coffee during the vigil? Or because he has sex with Marie and watches a Fernando film with her one day after the funeral? Or because he makes friends with Raymond, who is a pimp? Or because he murders the Arab by shooting him 5 times? It is essential to understand actually what morality means in an absurd world, or whether it means anything at all. Because a human being still has to make choices, and that's what we see so frequently with Mousseau. According to the absurd, there are no fixed or higher truths that a man can discover about his life. In the face of such uncertainty, there is no basis for morality or justification for acting one way as opposed to another. But as I said earlier, the choices are there before a human being, and he has to make it. The trial also very clearly exposes various facets of this lopsided morality, where the court becomes not a legal, but a moral entity standing in judgment of Mousseau's morals and not his crime. In the end, the reader knows that the hero is being tried for the crime of murder, but he is being punished for not crying at his mother's funeral. Camus said, I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I cannot know that meaning and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that I understand. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle, I also know that I cannot reconcile them. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, and which means nothing within the limits of my conditions? Unquote. Rousseau is always reflecting upon the idea that the world doesn't have a moral compass. Life is not rational and human actions do not matter, but one is still faced with the prospect of making choices and making some sense of an ever-changing universe. His viewpoint is so clearly reflected in these lines. I quote, I had been right, I still was right, I was always right. I had lived my life one way and I could just as well lived it another. I had done this and I hadn't done this thing and I had done another, and so, unquote. The conundrums are many and a human being oscillates between them. Society has a preconceived notion that their morals are correct and anybody thinking anything differently is essentially a criminal, and that's what Rousseau is made out to be. The criminal justice system reflects itself as being highly judgmental, in which the entire apparatus guns for a man who is essentially being victimized by a system. In fact, during the courtroom, there is also talk about his soul, and Rousseau is completely lost for words. The morality of the French people is upheld when Rousseau is to be executed in public. Colin Wilson succinctly defines the character of Rousseau as such. The outsider's case against society is clear. All men and women have these impulses to really do wrong and to do things which are really out of the world. Yet they keep up a pretense to themselves, to others. Their respectability, their philosophy, their religion are all attempted to gloss over, to make look civilized and rational something that is savaged, unorganized, irrational. He is an outsider because he stands for the truth. Maria Genovese says that Camus believed that despite the limitations in perspective and the absurdity of life, humans can make decisions that lead to less suffering. This is not the eradication of evil. It is instead the work of humans to reduce suffering when they can, to act with the acceptance that all cannot be healed, resolved, or explained on the earth. Letting go of such an ideal allows people to focus on present temporal existence where other humans need to be and can be helped. So I'll just end with the words at the end of the novel in which the kind of a redefinition and a relook at whatever he imagined to be sort of his idiom of living. His words at the end of the novel become reflections of his redefinitions of his kind of template of living in a meaningless world, where morality and religion assumed a new kind of a meaning, non-judgmental, non-dogmatic, and spontaneous. So I quote, "As if this great outburst of anger had purged all my ills," and that was his encounter with the chaplain, "killed all my hopes, and looked up at the mass of signs and stars in the night sky, and laid myself open for the first time to the benign indifference of the world. And finding it so much like myself, in fact so fraternal, I realized that I'd been happy and that I was still happy." Thank you.
Thank you, Harpreet. Thank you for highlighting, Rousseau's dilemma about, to believe or be damned, and to be, to be wicked or to be moral. I think that was Camus' dilemma, and it is everybody's dilemma. So, well, we'll discuss and debate later. Meanwhile, last call, if Professor Sanjay Mukherjee, if you can hear me, please do call Professor Jedka. She sent you an email with her phone number. So maybe you still have time to hop on to the panel, please. We'd love to have you here. So meanwhile, while we're hoping he can join us, the next paper, or then that will be the last paper then, Disha Pokhriyal from Jamia Millia Islamia. Again, she's speaking on the outsider. The title of her paper is To Live, to Lie, Reading the Outsider to Travel Within. And she again is focusing on this most important character, Musaw, and she discusses, she says, is reading a character different from reading our own self? So let's hear Disha Pokhriyal. Disha.
Thank you so much, and I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
So, and yeah, so I think I'll begin right away because reading The Outsider in the days of the lockdown sort of made me really restless in a way. So I felt that The Outsider narrativizes the nuances of a philosophy as it is lived in everyday reality. If we have no access to definitions of God, crime, judgment, or love, how do we make sense of our everyday actions? We develop a vocabulary to live our lives. Camus examines this language, which includes hope, habit, belief, God, and fear. Meursault, the protagonist of The Outsider, moves away from this language into a silence. Silence is the moment of reflection on the absurd, a strange, unnerving silence which breaks the patterns of everyday life. Camus has stated that we come into this world and begin in the realm of life and not in the realm of thought. To live is to see and observe the passage of our actions, the movement of society, and the emotional and linguistic realms inhabited by other people. Camus envisages for the writer two characteristics which are visible in Meursault. First, the refusal to lie about what one knows. And here I'd just like to quote from the afterword to the novel where Camus writes, lying is not only saying what isn't true, it is also, in fact, specially saying more than is true. And in the case of the human heart, saying more than one actually feels. So that is the first characteristic, the refusal to lie. And the second is resistance to oppression. Oppression which is not just institutional, but also experiential. This assumes importance in the arena of the absurd, which is the conflict between the desire for life when young and the subsequent discovery of death. Camus describes this conflict in many ways, and these are Camus' words: revolt of the flesh, denseness and strangeness of the world, discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, the stranger who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, the familiar yet alarming brother we encounter in our own photographs, confrontation of the irrational and the wild longing for clarity, and finally, confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Therefore, along with life, death and a vacuum in our existence becomes areas of exploration for Camus, making him ask emphatically the meaning of one's life and the relationship between thought and death. Camus writes that beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. This means that from the realm of life, when we are introduced to the realm of thought and criticality, our doubts begin to emerge and our existence begins to become a little less satisfactory. The Outsider reveals an interaction of selves which exist at varied levels. The idea of the self creates the thread between the writer, the character, the story, and the reader. Meursault is surrounded by people who are moving towards some kind of resolution. The desire for resolution, the compulsions of relationality, and the callousness of a structure or a system which seeks conclusions and definite responses are spaces of critique in the novel. Now, there are two parts to the novel. Part one, I find it dwells on Meursault living out his identity. It is a catalogue of behaviors, rituals, habits, speech that Meursault sees in people and society. Part two is when this lived identity is put under the searchlight. It is scrutinized and redefined by those who are part of the legal system. There is a shift which occurs in two locations of the text, and that is where I wish to focus on, which is the last chapter of part 1 and the last chapter of part 2. Therefore, I find the killing of the Arab on the sea beach and the outburst at the chaplain in the prison to be significant climactic moments when Mirza encounters the absurd, tests his defiance, and chooses to be a happy Sisyphus, because he's conscious and awakened by the inevitability of death and the uncertainty of life. In killing the Arab, Mirza chooses to face a certain strangeness in his situation. It's a desire to act alone, to experience solitude while he kills in a moment of clarity, yet ambiguity. While reading the text, there is also a sense that Mirza did not have any real animosity with the Arab. Therefore, killing him gives the tinge of absurdity to the situation. One can never know what precisely provoked Mirza to shoot. Even in terms of the narrative, it is only so much that the writer is willing to tell us. The act of killing seems different from the act of committing defiance. There is a slight difference that I see here. We are told that the Arab was killed in the first shot. It was a lifeless body. So what happens between the first shot and the additional 4 shots, and which are very famously called the 4 sharp knocks at the door of unhappiness? This gap provokes questions which are similar to why Mirza did not cry at his mother's death, or why he did not want to see her body. So these decisions or intentions constitute the innermost part of ourself, which even we might never be fully aware of. Mirza struggles to move away, yet understand the established protocols of each of the spaces that he inhabits. His journey begins from the old age home to his office, his apartment, the beach house, the court, the prison cell, and an eventual execution. It is on the beach, the merging of sand and water, the experience of nature at its most relentless, where one realm meets the other. It is in this in-between space that Mirza's realization becomes acute. It is in the world of the court and in his interactions with the lawyer that he feels the most misunderstood, because of that world's demand of knowing precisely why things happen. In comparison, his mother, Murray, his lover, and others are satisfied or have made peace with Mirza's silence and his actions. Camus writes, in certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be a pretense. But if that reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again, then it is, as it were, the first sign of absurdity. The silence and the presence of the stranger like Mirza has been seen as unsettling, more so in the official realm. It is what irks the lawyer who represents Mirza and the magistrate, because more than the killing, they are unable to fathom the killer himself. Mirza stands at the cusp of choices. For every situation, however grand or mundane, he always has to think about taking a step forward and allowing absurdity to unravel, or retracting and allowing himself to return from a possible awakening. It is in the space of the court and the prison that all his decisive acts are magnified and investigated, making his everyday living into an unreal objective spectacle. At times, even Mirza is unable to recognize that it is him that the court and law are actually talking about. So therefore, for Camus, it is the thoughtless and relentless pursuit of clarity, hope, solution, or conclusion that makes our lives miserable. And in a world which wants to take position and sides and pin down exact intentions behind all that one does and says, is a world where the mind of a doubting, reflecting, and brooding self is crushed and annihilated. So this ends the first part of my presentation, which was on this idea of habit and how the silence breaks the habit. Next, I came across this very interesting idea by Aidan Curzon Hobson, which is called the pedagogy of the absurd. And I very briefly wanted to discuss that too. So Aidan Curzon Hobson's work is on Camus and education. And he's written a series of essays which talks about how existentialism and the teaching of Camus works in the classroom can enable the educator and the learner to become more sensitized towards their own existence. So this is Hobson's idea of introducing Camusian dilemmas to talk of teaching learning spaces. Hobson wants the teacher and student to articulate the real and lived experience of dislocation in our lives. Learning spaces must recognize the limits of our rationality and meaning-making exercises. Both the educator and the learner have to recognize the gap between our own sense of certainty and hope and how it is going to be manifested in the world. Learning spaces must create doubt, and moreover, understand the importance of sustaining doubt. Making absurdity familiar to learners would mean bringing them closer to a self-examination which seeks escape neither in hope, nor in ambition, or dream, or withdrawal. So as Mirzo says, finally, the struggle always is to keep one's own voice alive in one's head. To travel within is to initiate that treacherous journey of knowing the self, yet watching the self elude our meaning-making desires. I would like to end by, what Camus has written in The Myth of Sisyphus, and it echoes very strongly with The Outsider. He says, "Forever I shall be a stranger to myself." Thank you.
Thank you, Disha. I think, you made some very interesting statements. Maybe we can have some questions over them, silence breaks the habit, and then of course the role of pedagogy as you discussed it, and then you said to keep one's voice alive in one's head. These are very interesting statements, and of course deeply philosophical too. So one can debate on these and discuss. And meanwhile, we do have questions both in the question answer chat as well as on the other chat. But meanwhile, we are so happy to welcome finally Professor Sanjay Mukherjee, from Saurashtra, who we're able, to have on board. Welcome, Professor Mukherjee. So he'll be speaking on our unreal cities, reading the wasteland approaching 2022, reading it through the fastness of its past and its apocalyptic future. Well, sounds like a very promising paper, and we are just waiting to hear you, Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you very much, as well as sorry to give you so much of trouble, Manju ma'am, and thank you very much for connecting me again. This seminar is on bringing back the texts as signposts, and which was so very comprehensively spoken about by Professor Williams also. This is such a good thing. We are all coming back to our texts. And my attempt, so much can be said about the wasteland, but my attempt within the given time is to, as Andrila has also mentioned, about this difficulty aspect that Larkin was talking about, the difficulty even today, even after all that has been written and said about the wasteland, the difficulty of reading as a reader, the wasteland, as well as what I contend is that with the lens of so many theories in the second half of the 20th century coming up, I contend that many of these have been actually anticipated in this poem. So this is what these two things are what I look at. Literature is news that stays news. This is what Ezra Pound had said. And not, to borrow from Wallace Stevens, become last month's newspaper to wrap flowers. But only the very best of literary works can come up to being news that stays news. When I attempt to reread The Wasteland today, as it approaches 100 years of its publication, I am reminded that I'm also reading a poem against the context of 100 years of the Spanish flu that took at least 50 million lives. Our Vice Chancellor, sir, in the inaugural session did remember the Spanish flu. It is interesting to note that on April the 5th, 1918, Kansas Public Health Report first mentioned what would go on to become Spanish flu. One of the reasons probably why April is the cruelest month. April 5, 1918, Spanish flu is reported. one can connect in the poem with the character of the Fisher King. Tiresias has been spoken about, but the Fisher King, his land is cursed with an epidemic. He himself is wounded in the groin, and therefore he is rendered sterile. And sterility and fertility becoming such a potent binary in this entire poem. And talking about binary, we remember the structuralist endeavor to build up discourse through binaries. One very meaningful activity that we did in my MA classroom is to look at binaries in the poem, and just from the first section, Burial of the Dead, we could find out at least 25 binaries in the poem. As a way of contextualizing this poem again, we remember that we have just crossed the 100 years of the Great War. Professor Williams has spoken about it, 19,000 British soldiers dying in a day, for example. Again, April the 6th, 1917, US decides to join the Great War. So another reason probably, April 6, 1917, US decides to join the Great War. Another reason why probably April might be the cruelest month. I only remind you of a line from section 1 of the poem. I had not thought death had undone so many, by which Eliot mentions not only the so many dead, but the consequential undoing of so many things. You see, from the Renaissance onwards, Europe becomes the primary continent, and suddenly it seems to be undone. So this is the larger thing that is being undone. And by introducing the character Stetson in the poem a few lines just after, where this character is seen coming from Mylae, that is the Punic Wars of 260, the wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Eliot seems to be pointing out that war as an agency keeps on repeatedly rendering human civilization into wastelands. And so when we read this poem, by the way, today, there seems to be a sense of the deja vu. The progress and achievement, what we have today, is suddenly being undone by the COVID-19 pandemic. The polarization of power that is building up between China and US. Would we have another war, for example? And every day we are being starkly reminded about our environmental undoing, something that will remain even when we get the vaccine, and something which was reminded in the third section of The Wasteland with the depiction of the polluted River Thames. Now, I'm not trying unnecessarily to enshrine Eliot with any kind of clairvoyance here. By the way, there's a counterfeit clairvoyant, Madame Sosostris was mentioned in the poem. But among the various metaphors for great literature, mirror immediately comes to mind, and after M.H. Abrams, the lamp also comes to mind. Our own signposts, our own milestones, these are metaphors for great literature. But with this poem, particularly, the metaphor of the crystal ball, slightly foggy though, becomes very apt. And even after the 100 years of this poem, that we come to this difficulty of finding a proper strategy of reading the poem. This poem is not a neatly written poem like the very famous another poem, for example, Ode on a Grecian Urn. I take this poem because Eliot seemed to have had a particular problem with the ending of Ode on a Grecian Urn. He did not like the kernel-like closure of the poem. And The Wasteland, of course, does not have any kind of a closure. But I want to put a question to all of you here. If to an Indian reader or an Indian audience, I ask that this poem, The Wasteland, is all about Ashanti, personal, social, with the poet coming to the end, praying for Shanti. How will you respond to it? Is it not a poem, looking at this poem in a kind of a closure? But of course, that would be a kind of an oversimplification, and a counter would be that this poem does not have any kind of an essential ending or any kind of essentialization for that matter. Both these arguments would actually hold water if we assume that we have been able to read the poem beyond its literal Latin and Greek epigraph. We cannot even say that this is all Greek and Latin to me because, well, it is Greek and Latin to us. And not to mention the vernacular, the Italian, a few lines later, we have the German. And just when we are trying to ponder over the significance of the title of the subsections, and just when we are pondering over, as I just mentioned, why would April be the cruelest month? We are digressed to trying to figure out who are the Sibyls and what happened to them, and where is this Cumae, and why at all, for example, does Eliot not dedicate this poem to Ezra Pound with a simple, straight to understand reverential note in English, instead of lifting the Italian phrase il miglior fabbro that Dante actually used to honor the 12th century Provençal poet Arnaud Daniel, and whom Dante called the best smith, and whom Petrarch called the grandmaster of love. By the way, Ezra Pound himself considered Arnaud Daniel as one of the greatest European poets. Thus, reading The Wasteland, we meander actually around many literary signposts and stalwarts, not just 100 years old, to come to realize that of Eliot's cunningness of exemplifying the two parameters of his famous 1919 essay, tradition on one hand and individual talent, which is also a critical milestone, by the way, which is also 100 years old. So reading The Wasteland, we have already arrived in a kind of a Derridean aporia, not to mention the deconstructive emphasis on the plurality of meaning, simply because in The Wasteland, there is a plurality of texts, which in turn reminds us of Yulia Kristeva's intertextuality and Bakhtin's dialogism and polyphony. By the way, please remember that Eliot wanted to title the poem as He Do the Police in Different Voices, polyphony. And the postmodern emphasis of little narratives. There are these little narratives of this character of the wife of the demobbed soldier in A Game of Chess, or the typist in The Fire Sermon, and the non-linearity, the synchronicity, recognizing therefore the Barthesian and the Foucauldian questions of the questioning the authority of the author, and even hearing the gendered subaltern to be speaking in the poem while negotiating the semiotics and orthography of popular culture. Remember the lines, "Oh, Mrs. Porter and her daughter, they wash their feet with soda water," and the song. Thus, applying the strategies we seem to be having under the rubrics of the reader's response theory. Remember, this poem also addresses a reader. "Oh, hypocrite reader, my fellow man, my brother," is taken from the French. And this brings us within the time that we have. For example, these so many the difficulties that we have, I have already mentioned. If we just stick to, for example, the first opening line, "April is the cruelest month," you see it is very well known that Eliot is extending and countering our Chaucer. April is the sweetest month, so April becomes now in the 20th century the cruelest month. There is not only this kind of a countering in the poem. We will find when the nightingale is mentioned with the word jug jug inside the poem, and jug jug being the dirty word in The Wasteland. Actually, these two words, not only from Ovid, but jug jug is being lifted by from Coleridge's The Nightingale in Lyrical Ballad. So there are all these references, there are all these allusions that we have to keep on taking. I mentioned about the pandemic, the Spanish flu. I mentioned about the Great War. April is also the month of the crucifixion of Christ, by the way, being the cruelest month. And let us also remember two things from his personal life. Now, for example, his courtship with Vivian Hay Wood, which resulted into a very unhappy marriage. His courtship actually began in the month of April 1915, very brief courtship, and then he got married. And his work with the Lloyd's Bank, he got a job with the Lloyd's Bank on 17th March 1917. So within 1 month of probation, he really saw what the trap he was in. On one hand, he had to earn. Now he was married, but on the other hand, working day after day in the basement of that bank. 1921, he suffers neurosis. He suffers a mental breakdown. He has to take a break from the bank. Also, please remember, when we are talking about the shift from the agrarian way of life to the industrial way of life, and we have to remember that the first World Trade Fair in 1851 was held in London from the 1st of May, with April being the entire month of preparation for that World Trade Fair. So we have historical, we have religious, we have personal, we have economic and cultural, we have literary. I mean, centrifugally moving out references just to come to the first line of the poem. What I'm trying to say, therefore, is not only this poem seems to be, with the lens of all these theories that have gone by, seems to be anticipating quite a few of them, but also we as readers, we have to devise our strategy even today with this poem. And it feels, for example, when we come to, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, when we look at this poem and then we immediately after ending the poem, we go to Eliot's own notes. How does it look like? I mean, do we have any poem with the poet's own notes going into it? I mean, kind of a reckoner which tries to confuse us more rather than making things easier for us, which tells us that we have to read Jessie Weston, James Fraser, among other things. Of course, we have to go to the book of Ezekiel, the New Testament, Buddha's fire sermon, and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, amongst others. Which Eliot read in the German translation. The poem itself reads like an extremely erudite and very complicated research paper, calling us to pay careful attention to the secondary and the tertiary sources, that is, other literary and cultural signposts, by virtue of this numerous and by virtue of this very interesting, very perplexing aspects, probably because of this. Ezra Pound might have called this poem as the longest in English. When he meant, he did not mean counting the lines, of course. And of course, he held this poem up when we come to the later facsimile version of the poem that we have here, edited by Eliot's second wife, Valerie Eliot. There is a small note by Ezra Pound that is written in 1967, where he says, where he talks about this entire endeavor of bringing out this poem in the year 1922. So this seems to where he calls this poem, he recollects the poem being one of the most important example of the modern movement in English poetry. Thank you very much. I give a pause here. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. I think that was a wonderful presentation and we nearly missed you and your wonderful paper. Well, you know, I think there's a wonderful end to the session of papers because you've brought us back to the present and the times and how, you know, I mean, it's amazing how the literary greats, they seem to have this apocalyptic vision, and somebody's posted here also on the group saying, how would it seem, you know, if today somebody writes a poem and 100 years later on, somebody analyzes and tries to relate it to the current times. So I think very interesting, and how you relate it to the present times. With this, well, now the session is open. We already have questions and comments. We'll start with those. And I think we've had a wonderful session with, you know, the realist and the mythic, and, you know, cross purposes of these two the writers. And let's see now what these questions say. So we have a question from Ashu to all the panelists. Anybody is, you know, free to answer. A general question. Someone said the perfect poem can never be written. Okay, and I see that Eknath has already replied, but maybe he can respond, you know, live. But so what the question is that the perfect poem can never be written because if it does, the world will end. In this context, does any Larkin poem come close to perfection? And Eknath says, I don't think his poems were perfect. I also believe perfection is something that everyone lacks. This is the reason why other people try to fix it and will have new dimensions. Would you like to add to that, Eknath? You need to unmute yourself.
As I've already expressed there, my answer is the same. Not only poetry, there's no perfect music, there's no perfect pedagogy, there's no perfect song in the world. So this is the reason why new evolutions have been happening, and we are doing innovations. And this is the reason why we live. This is the reason why we are more intelligent than our forefathers, and our next generation will be wiser than us. This is the reason why the poetry today is different than what used to be 100 years back. And the poetry after 100 years will be completely different than what we are reading now. So change is life, actually. Change is inevitable. And there can be good writers, there can be better writers, but to be the best, I think it's almost impossible. Thank you.
Thank you. Sudipta wants to say something.
I just want to add something to it, that when the question was asked that if Larkin's poetry stands to the perfection, stands to the perfection, I just want to say that here the word perfect, we should take it in the sense that during the age when Larkin was writing the poetry, it was perfect for the society, perfect for the people or not. And to that sense, I think that what Larkin was writing at that time was perfect to his age. He was representing the society through his age. He was representing the avarices of the society. He was representing the faults of the society. He was representing the materialistic purposes of the society. And I think for that reason, his poems were perfect for the society at that time. And if we can interpret the perfection as now, fine. Thank you.
Okay, like it always happens, last night my keyboard was giving me trouble and I was panicking. So ma'am, Jedka, if you could just scroll, I'm not able to scroll and read some of the questions there, I'll be grateful. And then I'll take the question and answers later on the Q&A chat. There's a
question from Vivek. There's a question from Vivek Sachdeva, especially for Harpreet. Camus said, there is only one serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. In the light of the number of suicides being committed by people in India under COVID-19, do you think Indian society is heading towards its own absurdism, a deeper crisis? Second, do you find our Indian society attitude towards religion and faith changing? So, Harpreet, think and tell.
Harpreet, you're muted. Harpreet, you're muted. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sachdeva, for the question. And yes, I think in light of COVID, when you talk about the number of suicides, they're really frightful, and we're seeing them happening so frequently. And I do think that this whole this whole crisis of the COVID itself has exposed a certain kind of absurdism in our life. And probably, when many a time we say, that suicide is an act of cowardice, etc., it requires a lot of strength to be able to actually take your life. But then the reason why people take their life is obviously because they have not been able to fathom a meaning. So I think this whole crisis of the COVID has really thrown up this idea that, probably it's not just India, but probably the whole world moving towards its own kind of absurdism. Because, we've looked at how, countries like Italy and countries like America, which have the best health systems, have been most affected. And no wealth and no, material kind of possessions or hospitals or anything have been able to really counter that. So I think there is an an inherent, inward-looking thing that's needed to be able to find meaning. And yes, the absurdism has probably always been there, but probably there are flashes which come in between, which make us, look at it more closely. And like Camus, very often in his novel *The Outsider* says that it's not the question of being happy all the time; it's the question of just getting used to everything. And probably this new kind of idiom that we're looking at is a new kind of absurdism. And it's more than 50 days in the lockdown, and we're sort of getting sort of used to even living this life that we never thought that we would. The second part of the question that Professor Sachdeva has asked me is, do you think religion and faith in India is on the wane or it's changing? I think that was the question. I think, in India, there are some things which will not change. And I think religion and faith are going to be there. But yes, I think in terms of, its characteristics or what we understand very strictly and what comes within its ambit, obviously things are always going to change. Like I was just watching this serial today called, the Ganga Upanishad, and it talked about the Vanprastha ashram. It talks about the 4 ashrams that the human life is divided into. And, they were saying that Vanprastha ashram is, a preparation for the sannyas ashram. And, when you look at life now, and when you look at, people in their old age, and, they're sort of, they feel that we've got to remain young forever. So probably some tenets and some things are changing, but I think the basic fabric is always going to be the same. And especially in times of COVID, I think going back to where we belong and going back to, finding those roots, I think just becomes very essential. Thank you.
A related question here from Ahmad Ahsanazul. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry, I pronounced your name wrong. Thank you for the presentation, which I think has been quite absorbing. Well, for Camus, the mythical Sisyphus is the ultimate absurd hero who, in Camus' opinion, lives life to the fullest, hates death, and is condemned to a meaningless task. How will you relate these ideas to Meursault in defining him as an absurd hero?
Thank you for the question.
Maybe we can put it to Disha, because Disha also spoke on Camus.
Yeah, okay, ma'am, that's fine.
To Harpreet. That's okay.
No, if Harpreet ma'am wants to answer, she can begin and then I can continue. It's okay with me.
No, it's okay. Disha, you can go ahead. That's fine. I answered the first one.
Okay. So, for me, I think the way I read the character, it was, I could relate to, this sense of developing an acceptance. And it's not an acceptance which verges on complacency, but it is an acceptance which wants to look life in the face. And that's how I see the character. I mean, even if it's about death, there is, and specifically when he is himself imprisoned, a lot of memories about his mother come back to him. And that's when finally he truly feels that I should not have cried for my mother, because it was in the final days of her life that she actually began to relive. Because I would just like, now that I'm answering, there's another question which came on crying and, should he have cried at his mother's death? I think Camus wants or especially when I read it, because it's about moving away from this vocabulary and from these dichotomies that we love to inhabit, even if it's about crying or not crying, feeling happy or not feeling happy. Because even if we say he should have cried, even if we say he should have done this, we are moving towards a certain conclusive stance. And I think Meursault, even when he's told that you are going to die, he's not very comfortable with that, because he feels that how can things be so absolute? How can somebody have completely no choice whatsoever? So I think the Sisyphean thing is more about one which I did mention in my presentation. It's about if I read it correctly, I think it's about seeing Sisyphus more happy, because that bit about when he's walking down the slope, that is his moment that is his agential moment. That is where he's able to reclaim subjectivity. and he does not, yes, of course he has to, you know, sort of push the boulder, you know, all the way up, but I think somewhere he's able to see things for what they are. He's not overwhelmed, and he knows that this is what life has to bring to me, and he does not become optimistic or positive and happy, and neither does he you know, sort of sink into this kind of sadness or depression. I think staying in this in between space is what I personally found to be I mean, especially even during these times, it's very easy to take one stand or the other. But to be able to just exist on a day-to-day basis and be able to, you know, sense the multiplicity of feelings, I think that has been that's how I understand the absurd, and if I've been able to answer.
Could I request the panelists or the presenters to be a little brief, because I see we're running out of time. And we do have a few more questions. In fact, the question to you, Disha, from Gopi Sankar was, apart from discussing Camus or other existential works to literature students, suppose we employ these texts to engage with those who are pursuing non-literature majors. Does the pedagogical study mention an age group?
Yes, so it's very interesting because in fact Aidan Hobson is not a literature professor. He teaches in a polytechnic. I mean, from the designation that I read, and there is a whole range of literature which is, I mean, you know, it's just like teaching Foucault to a scientist. So it's he has made this kind of existential writing available to students who are doing engineering, so that, you know, they can move out of absolutism, they can move out of certainties, and be comfortable existing, you know, in this very grayish area of not knowing what to do all the time, not deriving meaning. So yes, in fact, Aidan Hobson's affiliation is he is not a literature professor. I mean, of course he teaches English, but he's doing it in a technical space.
Professor Kang, if I can just add one line to this.
Okay, yeah, sure.
In fact, I teach The Outsider to students of law, you know, in a major class. So even, you know, that in a sense is, you know, exposing them to all the loopholes and the pitfalls in the judicial system itself in trials as well. And I think it's a very interesting text to be able to expose them to even these aspects, you know. So completely non-literature students of law. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. So there's a question for Ankita. Ankita, that was a very interesting paper, says Bhavna Shrey. One hardly thinks of spanning this range of spatio-temporal divide. I'm just wondering whether the jazz age held any overt or covert influence of the modernists?
Actually, the age was basically popular during the 1920s and 1930s. So it took a bit of time to reach Europe. But when it reached Europe, then Europe was reeling from the First World War. And when James Joyce had already drawn attention to the paralysis of public life, and W.B. Yeats has talked about the lack of a center, I feel the Europeans accepted the jazz movement and had a different approach to it. And not necessarily British literature, but the literature of Paris, and especially Paris was the center of culture and everything of Europe. They took it in, and I think they made it their own and was greatly influenced by the jazz age.
And Ankita, another question for you from Ahmed Ehsan Zaman. Thank you for the presentation. What is your own take on the much talked about ending of the wasteland? Actually, we could even ask Professor Mukherjee to comment on that because he was talking about it.
Yes.
But yes, would you like to briefly say reply to that?
Yeah, Professor Sanjay Mukherjee has already told us that there's no closure to the poem. The poem ends with Datta Dayadham Damayata Shanti Shanti Shanti. So Iliad is, according to my opinion, is trying to end on an optimistic note, because it was written on the lack of transcendental vision of the modern life. And so I think just he was trying to be optimistic, and Shanti is the word that by which like most of the mantras ends with. So I think that is the point that Professor Mukherjee said. I'll just agree with that.
Professor Mukherjee, would you like to say something? And then there's a question also from Vivek Sachdeva.
Right, ma'am. Actually, that is why I threw up this question, that how would it be if we look at this poem as somebody who is kind of bringing together personal, individual, social, historical, political Ashanti in Europe, and then praying for Shanti. That is, interestingly, the Brihad Aranyak Upanishad has the discourse where the gods go first to Brahmaji, then men go, and then the asuras go. Now here, what Eliot is doing is, he is putting the men first. And to men, it is said, ki datta, to give, don't hoard, give. And so are we to interpret that in the 20th century, and this is a time when personally also Eliot is looking for a faith. Eliot, a few years later, will convert into Anglo-Catholicism. He is even delving with Buddhism at this point of time. So can we say that in this 20th century, what the poet interprets is that all these qualities of the Danav and the Asur actually reside in human beings. So it is all the three, Datta, Dayadhvam, Damayata, all the three actually apply to the human beings. How would it be? I mean.
And we have another question from Vivek Sachdeva for you. Sanjay, yes, I would like to have you back to the classroom. Do Indian students respond only to references to Upanishad in the poem? I want to know, how do they respond to the very idea of the wasteland in the present times?
Well, as I discussed, that this is one poem that nobody picks up for leisure reading. If we go back to our times also, we were prompted to read this poem. Then some of us got really interested. And now that we are students and teachers in the classroom, we have to devise certain strategy to read this poem along with the students. What I often do is I go to Death by Water first. If you look at that short fourth section of the poem, you need not have any other background. It can be a very close reading, new critical close reading of Death by Water, the fourth section of Wasteland. And what does it talk about? It talks about, once upon a time, this guy was handsome and young, now he is dead. So all of you, please think about death, think about some kind of a finality. So with this, then we talk about, so we are alive, life versus death. This is one kind of a binary that we are talking about. And then, as I mentioned in the classroom, we go and try to tease out, we try to discover other binaries like sterility, fertility, for example, memory, past, desire, future, for example. So in this way, I try to generate some interest, and in a batch of 60, there are always 6 to 7 students who really like this poem, carry forward this poem, discuss this poem, and so on. That is what my response would be. Thank you.
Professor Jedka, it's time. Do we continue with the questions? Do we have some more time, or do we call it a day?
You know, it's very tempting really, because T.S. Eliot is really one of my favorite poets, and I have done some work on him and his Wasteland. And I actually am planning a full session, a proper seminar on T.S. Eliot, but 2 years hence. If we all survive coronavirus, and if we all are still around, we'll certainly meet on the 100th anniversary.
2022.
2022. Yes, 2022, we will meet again. And there are lots of questions coming up. We can go on and on, but I think, Manpreet, you could do a quick round of all the speakers and see if they have anything to say, any last words to say to the audience, because we have a lot of people watching us.
Right. So sorry to the ones, to the listeners who posted more questions. Well, you keep them for 2022, hopefully, and if they are on the wasteland. Meanwhile, all our panelists are here. There was a question for Andrella. I missed that. But anything any of you would quickly like to say before we wind up? Ankita is, Sudipta, really, anything you would want to say? And Andrella, Ghoshdev.
Can I go on, ma'am?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I just want to say that after my paper, you were talking about the similarities between the poetry of the Philip Larkin or the movement poetry and the beat poets. I almost find a very great similarity between because both in different countries, both the movements were almost writing on the same things. They were rejecting the standard narrative procedures. They were talking about sexual liberation. They were portraying the human conditions of of their society in the United States and there in the United Kingdom. So I think there is a lot of similarity between the beat movement, between the beat poets and Philip Larkin, though there's much explanation to it, but I do not have time.
Louder, Sudipta, louder, louder.
There are a lot of explanation to it related to the similarities between the beat movement and similarly the contemporary its counterpart in the United Kingdom, that the movement poetry. But as I've mentioned, that there are similarities. The same similarities continue with the beat movement also.
Thank you, Sudipta, for addressing my comment, responding to that. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Andrella, would you like to say something?
Yes, I find a question posed by Monali Chatterjee to me. I think I would want to respond.
Closer, please.
Yeah.
Closer.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, louder. Yeah, closer.
Yeah. I find Monali Chatterjee addressing a question to me, which I wish to respond to. Thank you, Monali, for your compliment. And yes, you have asked me what is the pertinence of Philip Larkin in the present day? How can his poems appeal to those who are students of professional courses? As I had talked about Larkin's ability to maintain the connection between the audience and the poet, which had been undercut by the so-called modernist poets. So again, courses which are designed for professional students would often go for poetry, which would be slightly different and less full of allusions and symbolism and metaphorical usages. That is what I have found when I have glanced at the course material of certain universities, the law universities or the other universities. So again, because Larkin, to some extent, is responding to his contemporary world, undoubtedly, the post-Second World War Britain, but the issues and the things that he talks about are very relevant for every age and every condition, and the pessimism or the depression or the dismay at the change, the transition, all these are universal elements, I think, which are easy to relate for any student in the particular in this particular time in the 21st century. So, and obviously the students of professional courses would find it appealing, as well as a kind of diversion from all the other kind of work or literature that they are being taught.
Manpreet, we need to wind up, so go around, but answer should not be more than one sentence long, please.
There's a desperate repeated question from Roshan. I don't know if you would want me to,
in one sentence, if you can answer it, Sanjay.
Okay. Hi, this is Roshan. A question for Professor Sanjay. How would you respond to the intertextual dimension of Eliot's creative consciousness? Doesn't it both synchronize with his concept of tradition and also evidence postmodernist aspect of his critical consciousness? Wow, long question, but we need a short answer. Thank you.
I just responded, ma'am, and I said, I think you are, Vivek, you are echoing what I just mentioned in my presentation. It is heavily intertextual, and it does anticipate certain aspects of postmodernity. Thank you.
Anybody from the faculty, Lata or Purnima, anybody would want to say something?
Dheeraj, you want to say something?
Oh, nothing. It's such a lovely session it was. Really enjoyed it. It's up to everyone.
Purnima?
Thank you so much. It was such an enlightening session, and we are looking forward to more days now. Thank you so much.
Okay. And Lata, anything?
Thank you so much, all the presenters, for demonstrating such great work.
Okay, so then I think we come to the end of this I enjoyed it thoroughly, enjoyable session. And thank you to all the presenters for the wonderful presentations. Thank you to all our listeners, viewers, and a big thank you to the Department of English, Professor Jedka and her colleagues, and to Shulini University for having me with you all. And thank you, and I hand it over to Professor Jedka for the closing whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Manpreet. Thank you, Manpreet. Again, you have done me proud. Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a very nice session, and I would like to thank all of you, Oindrila, Sanjay, Sudipto, Ankita, Harpreet, Disha, Ek Prasad, and of course, my dear colleagues, my very professional colleagues. Sometimes, there is an audio glitch, and I think that if I say something good, it might sound like something else. So I'm saying very nicely here. These are my lovely young colleagues. And of course, nothing is possible without them. Now, we have done the first day, and we discussed these 2 or 3 texts in detail. Tomorrow, we'll be moving on to the next session, again, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. And the panelists tomorrow, please do not get confused. I sent 2 emails, one to the panelists alone and one to the other people who are attending. And the panelists should click only the ones that is sent to the panelists, right? The shorter one. And the others will click on the other link, on the Zoom link, right? So please see that you click the correct one. Otherwise, you'll land up in somebody else's meeting room, or you'll be, hunting around for the right conference room to enter. So tomorrow we'll meet again at 2 o'clock. And until then, stay happy, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Manpreet. Thank you, everyone. Lata, you want to say some last words?
Yes, ma'am. I want to, give my hearty vote of thanks to Professor Manpreet Kang from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IPU Delhi. And I also would like to thank all the beautiful, amazing presenters for demonstrating such great work. We all are inspired by your words. And also, yes, our students who are watching us on YouTube, Facebook, who have turned up great in numbers. And it wouldn't have been possible without the support of our technical, this technology team from Shulini University. I would like to thank everyone, and this is just the beginning, and we have a long way to go. And as I say this, I just want to recite a poem by my best loved poet, Robert Frost. Woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. Miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Until tomorrow then. Bye. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Manju ma'am. Thank you,
Bye.
Professor Kang. Bye, ma'am.
Bye.